All right, folks, we are live for another edition of Christ Over Fear. I am your host, Chad Jenkins. This is episode 15 today, May 11th, 2022. I have one guy I've got to give a shout out to for putting this together and actually putting me in touch with our guest, and that is the one and only Christopher Copper. Chris and I were platoon mates in 2nd Ranger Battalion. Chris is a guest previously on this show. And he was very keen on making the introduction to Matt and I. Matt Parrish is the guest for today's episode. And it's pretty sweet because Matt and I were already connected on LinkedIn, following what he was doing. Everything he always puts out, I absolutely love. He's the host of SOFcast. It's U.S. Special Operations Command's official podcast. So I would, anybody who's out there who listens to this, please subscribe to SOFcast because it's just incredible content, what they're putting out. And then what he's doing at U.S. Special Operations Command, which we will ask as well. But special shout out to Chris Copper for making that happen and making that introduction officially to Matt and I. So thank you for that. Number two, as far as kind of the weekly intro, and what I typically try to do a little bit at the top of the show for the first 1 to 2 minutes. And it's actually from my daily devotional this morning. John Eldredge is the daily devotional guy that is the daily devotional author that I read right now. John Eldredge, he wrote a book, and now I'm having a brain freeze, but it's Wild at Heart. Wild at Heart, and that book, probably the best book I have ever read outside of the Bible, obviously, but just, from a true, authentic masculinity standpoint. It was at a time frame, 2017 is when I read that book, and I really needed that book. So I'm a huge John Eldredge fan, but his daily devotion today was about, seeing God, seeing Christ in all areas of our life, not just Sundays at church. And he's big into talking about today's culture and where today's culture wants to put Christ in a box and keep him there and not invite him into all the other aspects of our lives that we enjoy. For me, a big one I enjoy, I love golf. I love getting out there. I love playing golf. It's fun. My son now, he plays golf. He's better than I am, but it's something I enjoy. I love doing it. And I liked his point today because we can go do these fun, awesome things and think, I'm not, at least me, I'm taking time away from, being focused on Christ. No, like invite Christ into that moment. However that is, it doesn't have to be cheesy, but like being appreciative that he allows for us to go out and golf together, my son and I, and all of those aspects. But I think it just not only golf, but whatever endeavors, whatever you enjoy adventure wise, like let's recognize that Christ is in that too. He's not just in the Sunday 1 hour service. And we as men and as warriors, as combat veterans, we need to be the ones on the forefront of that and acknowledging that, recognizing that, owning that, and sharing that. So that is my 2 cents for today. But without further ado, let me bring on Matt Parrish, my man. Hey, and so the audience knows, Matt and I, we just did a quick comms check right beforehand. We both had lawn services going off and blowers going off in the background. That has quieted down. It's quiet on the X now. So, dude, I'm glad to have you. Yeah. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Chad. And I love that word, man. I completely agree. It's always a good reminder. Christ is not only in Sunday, but it's also not only like when we have a problem. Like, we got to be appreciative. Like you said, the opportunities that he's put in front of us. So thanks for having me. And yeah, thanks to Chris for connecting us, man.
Yeah. And I tell you what, I didn't do a good enough job of introing you. So 7th Special Forces Group, growing up in the Army and 7th Special Forces Group. And then SOCOM, First Sergeant, I believe. And correct, then, U.S. Special Operations Command, you're doing kind of dual hatting that senior enlisted leader role, as well as then the co-host and executive producer of SOFcast. So, man, you wear a lot of hats.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm lucky. I'll make a little bit of a tweak there. Senior enlisted leader for the preservation of the force and family, not for all of USSOCOM. My fellow co-host is the overall USSOCOM senior enlisted leader. but I am the top senior enlisted for POTFF, if you've heard of that, Preservation of the Force and Family, that we've had for the last 10 years or so, really trying to take care of like holistic human performance and wellness for all of our folks across the world. So yeah, I grew up as a special forces guy, and then felt like God told me to volunteer for this job, try to give back in my last couple of years as I was dealing with some injuries. And it's been an interesting ride to learn about some of this physical, spiritual, psychological wellness stuff that we're doing. So
well, and let's stay on that, because I want to hear about that, because I think it's so vital for, it's cheesy, but I'll just use the term for the warfighter, but it's so vital for the individuals that we ask to do that, and the family dynamic, the spouses, the children, the whole holistic, family component of that, not just the man or woman who is the actual, warfighter themselves, but the whole. So you said that's been within 10 years. That's when it kicked off, and what does that look like? Can you just go into that a little bit more? Because I saw that and I was like, man, that's very interesting. That's something that I think has been needed for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened is, some of this was starting before 10 years. Obviously, there was places in USSOCOM, like at Ranger Regiment, where we had the Ranger Athlete Warrior Program. We had the beginnings of Thor 3 and some other, like in SF groups and things like that. NSW, Naval Special Warfare, was starting to do some of these things. But it was really as a result of, after, multiple years at war in the global war on terrorism, we started seeing this fraying on our force and family. Admiral Olson at the time, testifying to Congress, talked about this fraying of the force and the family. And he commissioned a study to basically go around, do focus groups across all of special operations, every different tribe, so to speak, and just figure out, like, hey, why are we seeing these issues? Why are we seeing, breakdowns physically, breakdowns emotionally, breakdowns spiritually, breakdowns of our social and family? Like, what can we do to stem the tide? And what we realized is that as we were being employed so much throughout the global war on terrorism, that special operations had some special operations peculiar needs. We had some things where what was being provided from the conventional military for your average soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine was not addressing some of the needs that we had for special operations. So they created this at the time, it was called the Pressure of the Force and Family Pressure on the Force and Family Task Force, and then it transitioned into the Preservation of the Force and Family as an enduring effort. And so it started, a lot smaller than it is now, obviously, as they started just layering in physical therapists, strength and conditioning coaches, some more psychs and mental health resources, some extra things to kind of buoy our chaplains, cognitive performance folks, and then, putting a little bit more emphasis on some of the family stuff. In the Army, we've got family readiness groups and all those things, but in a lot of places, those aren't as formalized as they are in the Army. And so, as it's ebbed and flowed over the last 10 years, we've continued to grow. We've continued to see the return on investment of being more proactive on some of these things and not waiting until, we have red line incidents. And so we've continued to see return on investment. We continue to invest heavily to the tune of now it's about $100 million every year across the world. And nearly all of that is in labor, right? It's in hiring the best professionals in the world. For our strength and conditioning folks, it's people that have worked at the University of Georgia, University of Alabama, Olympic teams, Lakers, all these different things, taking those people and then hiring them to support the best, in the world as far as special operations. So it's a different job for me. Like I said, I didn't grow up as like some, human performance guru. I was just a Green Beret, spent 13 years on a team, was lucky enough to get that first sergeant job here as sort of the nominative headquarters first sergeant for SOCOM. And then, as I said, sort of felt led to volunteer for this job. And it's a rewarding way to give back to all of us, to all of our brothers and sisters out there, Chad, who are, swimming in our wake, so to speak, who are coming behind us. And I think all of us want to leave the formation better than we found it. We want to continue to keep pushing and moving forward.
Well, and that seems to be, the hallmark mentality of, the special operations community, leave it better than we found it. And even when we look, introspectively, what can Chad Jenkins, what can Matt Parrish learn about their experiences up until this point to help the guy who's getting ready to enter right now? And I think a lot of that, what you're talking about, especially on, you think about physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, mind, body, soul, spirit, however you want to carve that out, is a lot of that, especially on the mental, emotional, spiritual, for me at least, was education. Educating myself. If I could go back and educate myself, at an 18 to 22-year-old period of when I was that age, how much further along on the curve, and the hard lessons learned the hard way can we do that? And that sounds like, from a preservation standpoint, it sounds like that's what the goal is doing it on the front end to mitigate all the necessity on the back end.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I mean, it's a culture change, right? What we've seen a lot of, Chad, over the last 10 years or so, is we've done an incredible job of changing the culture when it comes to proactive readiness, especially on the physical side, right? Like I will assume that when you and Chris were in Ranger Battalion, it was similar to me as a new guy in SF. If you were going to sick call over like turning your ankle or tweaking your knee, you were a dirtbag, right?
Yeah,
like it was like, oh man, what do you? Oh yeah, you got to go to the doctor. Okay, yeah, might as well take your rucksack with you because you're not getting back in here, right? And then we started to realize, like, oh man, if I go and engage these world-class physical therapists and I get the ankle tweak taken care of, or I get the knee tweak taken care of, I might prevent the ACL blowout that's coming if I just continue to work on top of it, right? And so we've changed that culture within a lot of, nearly everywhere in special operations, where now it's looked at as a part of the soft profession of arms that you're going to proactively take care of some of those things on the physical side. The same way you're going to work out and make sure that you're ready to climb that mountain in Afghanistan. You don't wait until you get to the base of the mountain and then say, oh man, I need some aerobic capacity. I need some leg strength. Like, you work out to get ready for that, right? Well, now what we're trying to shift that to, because we all understand that as physical, right? Because we're all Rangers, SF, SEALs, combat controllers. We all understand that, right?
Yeah.
Now it's trying to change that culture into places like your psychological performance, your spiritual performance, your social and family. So we're talking about going left of the boom and not waiting until you're in the wake of a divorce or having suicidal ideation or all these different things, or a moral injury where you're, in a crisis of your soul, to say like, hey, maybe I should proactively work those muscles in the same way that I work these physical ones. And in the same way that I go to a physical therapist, maybe when I see a hint of trouble, when I start to see a crack in my marriage or in my social relationships or in my faith system, maybe I go engage with an expert early on and I get a tune-up. I go to a psych proactively, and I don't wait until all of a sudden it's a massive blow up and then I'm like, oh man, where are my resources? I'm in crisis, right?
Yeah.
So that's really the overall, like, our big push for culture change, is just to make sure that we understand that we're not unicorns. Like, if you look at the Global War on Terrorism, if you're a newer guy or gal in our formation, like, you have thousands of case studies of what this looks like, and none of us are unaffected by this. Even the guy or gal that you look at as a hero, who you think they are the archetype of what it means to be that special operator, they're having issues with some of these things too, unless they've proactively worked on those things to try to nip them in the bud. And so it really just is trying to message that, educate ourselves. And like you said, I think all of us, if we could go back to 2003 or whatever, and be like, hey man, like, shake ourselves by the collar and say, hey man, maybe, work on a few of these things, So,
which is huge. But I also think what's huge about that is, like, you used the great example. You went with physical, because we can all see physical, and think about that mentality shift that's had to take place. Because your example of like sick call and going like, no, suck it up, tape aspirin on it, let's go. Meathead type, mentality.
Right.
But that's something that you can actually see. The challenge then, especially on the mental aspect, emotional aspect, spiritual aspect, where it's really unseen, it's more thoughts and things of that nature. I feel like, and I say I feel like, because I know from my experience, like, those who led the front, those who were ahead of me that I knew, reached out and said, hey, I've hit my peak. I need to seek doing some work in the mental health space. And I say seek doing work rather than asking for help. Although, yes, it is a form of asking for help. It was also the hardest work I had ever done in my life. It superseded physical work all day long when I had to work on my mental wherewithal, my mental health. But I think when individuals, younger individuals, men and women, can see the older generation who are still in those stories and those kind of hallmark individuals that you're talking about that said, hey, I needed to do this, and this was what I did. Man, how inspiring that is, and how much of a shift that happens that takes place in the culture. Is that accurate?
100%.
What have you seen?
Yeah, 100%. And I'll say we stand on the shoulders of giants in so many ways, right? I'm certainly not by what I just said saying that we are currently changing the culture.
No, I know what you mean.
That work started before I was ever in POTFF, right? We had people that were willing to stand up and say, like, hey, I'm seeking mental health care. Like, I try to be very open about the fact that I've sought mental health resources in the past because I think it's needed to continue to break that stigma. But, we've had SOCOM senior enlisted leaders, go on the road and talk about, their marriage and, Chris and Lisa show for some of you who were around during that time. We've had a lot of people, if you think about the conversations that we're having now, Chad, versus like if you just picked up this conversation or any of these conversations that you see on different podcasts and dropped them into like the 2002 timeframe, it would be like unheard of.
Yeah,
right?
You're right.
So,
yeah.
I don't think that's a weakness. I don't think that's making us weaker. I think that we are acknowledging the fact that like the amount of stress and the amount of risk, mitigation that we take in every other way, we've got to also understand that like the stress of this as a career, as a profession of arms, like our maintenance plan on our rifles or on our other equipment is built over the fact that we know we're going to use it and it will break down if we don't maintain it. Mm-hmm. And so we have to also look at that, not just physically, but across the whole spectrum of, for POTFF, it's 5 domains: physical, psychological, cognitive, social and family, and spiritual. And we believe all 5 of those come together to create your overall human performance. Now, some of those are going to ebb and flow, and they can be buoyed by other ones, right? Like we had a great person on SOFcast, Lieutenant Colonel Ani Retkovsky, 12-time Ironman triathlete, Air Force pilot, black belt, done mixed martial arts, all these crazy things, right? Like, she's a phenomenal person who helps run POTFF at AFSOC. And she talks about when she's doing these triathlons, obviously she's physically prepared, but there's a moment where the physical is done, right? Yeah. Like the last part of a triathlon is running a marathon, right? Like it's nuts, right? And she gets to a point where it's only her spiritual side that allows her to overcome it. And she talked about that on our podcast and talked about how when you look at those 5 domains, you've got sort of your output gauge, but you've also got an input gauge. So you've got like a speedometer or a tachometer in each one of those domains, but you've also got a fuel gauge. So when we look at ourselves, like how well are you fueling yourself in each one of those, and how ready are you to pick up for an issue? Like you mentioned, the struggle of going through, some mental health work yourself. I had the same thing a few years ago as I physically, because of these, I've had 4 neck surgeries and continue to physically have to try to come back from some of these things. And the inability to burn physical stress started manifesting in mental health stuff, which I wasn't prepared for. Like I wasn't expecting to go into depression because I couldn't just do simple workouts anymore. Like I didn't recognize they were that interconnected until it happened to me. And then it's like, oh man, how can I help somebody else not have to make the same, not have to wait until they're in full depression to realize like, hey man, you got to work on all of these things and find a way to make sure that you're ready. When the time comes, that you have your resources available, that you know who to call, and that you can come back from it.
Yeah, no, that's so necessary. I mean, I'm just thankful that that's what's taking place. I mean, because the individuals coming in deserve that now and deserve to have that. And I also think of, Ranger Regiment, Special Forces groups, whatever, Tier 1 units, the motto of the infantry, right? To close with and destroy the enemy. And when that's the end all be all goal, and that's the number one mission that there is, understanding that we have to train all 5 of those elements to that point to do that mission for the security of our country, but then understand like there's the unwinding of that, and I think that's what was missing in 01, 02, 03, all the way, not predates '01. I mean, going back
Sure.
to, World War II timeframe there is a reason, there's a method to the madness in our training and everything else, where emotions and all those things and thoughts can be shelved to focus on the task at hand, the mission on hand. But then all those things will spike themselves at some point. Now, how do we mitigate that to your point, to stop the redlining from happening? And I think that's what's huge about the education standpoint that you all are doing.
Yeah, well, we can forsake everything for mission accomplishment very easily, right? Like that is the easiest thing for us to do, is to dump everything else on the priority list for that one mission accomplishment. And we know that we're the best in the world as a team of going and accomplishing that mission, right? Well, the problem is when that mission is not a one and done thing, when it's stretched over the course of it, just continually is another mission every night, like you and I have done on some of those task forces where you're hitting every night, sometimes 2 or 3 times a night. Well, you can't forsake everything to do that mission. So how do we make a new paradigm where now I'm cognizant of the fact that I have to maintain everything else while also not letting that mission dump, right? So I can't throw everything off the table to accomplish this one mission, because tomorrow night there's another one. So how do I make a new paradigm where I have to be ready in a steady state of all these things? Later on, when you come back and you're doing training and you're doing all these other things, to where now that stress is a cumulative, effect that ends up over the course of your career. If it's not checked, if you're not proactive about it, it becomes this, red line, or this, these terrible events later on. Because this is the longest war we've ever had. We haven't had this architecture like we have now, where we're constantly in a Jort cycle, or we're constantly working these things, where we're just in training and then going and then coming back. It's a new frontier. So how do we professionalize the ability to work on ourselves and maintain ourselves individually and as a team, so that we're always ready, right? And so this is one of our ways of investing in our human capital. We all know soft truth number one: humans are more important than hardware, and we truly believe that. So we've got to make sure that we're investing in those humans and the maintenance of the human weapon system in the same way that we do on all these other things, right? And so I think like I said, I'm very proud of, like, when I look across my career, not proud of the culture change that I've individually made. I'm proud of us as a military, and especially as a soft force, for being willing to break some of these eggs. Like I said, standing on the shoulders of giants whatsoever, absolutely. From some of the previous mentors and people that I looked up to, who were willing to stand up and be like, hey man, I'm going to go get some help. And it's because I want to come back here and I want to keep working hard, not because I want to, not because I'm broken and oh, woe is me. Like, I'm going to go get some help and I'm going to come back and be better. And that's we do that with everything else. So let's do it in our psych and spiritual and everything else. Yeah.
Oh man, I was not expecting us to go into such detail on this, but it's awesome. I love this conversation. Hopefully everybody else enjoys it. But it's just a thought of mine as you were speaking all of this and thinking about it, and I'm curious to get your viewpoint of this. But I think what that is doing right now at that location, I think that can be used in the civilian sector. I think that's like corporate sector. Because what you talk about, like the cumulative stress that, is continuing. Well, we just saw COVID-19. Everybody in the world experienced that. Corporations, individual households, everybody was phased by that, was affected by that stress. And there's all kinds of stresses because of the culture today, and, all the burdens, whether unnecessary or necessary, but that's just the stress levels higher in today's society. But what USSOC is doing, and what that can then be used, it's almost like a beta testing for what then society, American society, probably world society, can use to focus on all aspects of the human capital, which is the most important. You're 100% correct, but that's not just a soft thing. That's that's a family dynamic. Do you see that taking place one day?
100%. Yeah. 100%. And it's the same way. Like, soft is lucky because of some of the acquisitions authority, and because some of the special things that make SOCOM service like, in that we
Yep.
have, special ability to be a pathfinder for the DoD, whether it's new technology, like we're about to do SOFIC next week, big industry conference here in
Okay. Yeah.
Tampa, and SOCOM has the ability to acquire some technology in the same way that like some of the services do, and we can be the pathfinder. We're like a little more agile on some of those things, so we can be a pathfinder on those things, and then we either fail fast or we succeed, and then we're able to pass that on to the broader military, and then from the broader military, some of those things trickle down. In the same way for this human performance thing, like we've sort of been the vanguard on some of this, and some of our units more than others have been the vanguard that then we learned from here at SOCOM, that we then pushed out across the enterprise to all the different SOCOM equities across the world. And then now the DoD's doing things, the Army's doing things like holistic health and fitness, because they've had a 10-year case study to see that this works. To your point, 100% I see coming out of COVID, I think it's a huge shift, right? Like it has changed the workforce, right? Like the way that people are managed, the way that people work, all these things are different. And I completely agree on the cumulative stress aspect of, even things like, I'll tell you, for me, Chad, like I was just in some treatment, and one of the things that I realized is like one of my biggest enemies is my phone, right? Like what I considered, like I was having all of this cumulative stress and this oxidative stress where I was getting where I never felt like my rev limiter came back down. Like my RPMs would only come back to 7 or 8. And there was such a small amount, and I was in, mental health counseling, obviously in a lot of prayer and trying to figure out like, how can I work on this? And I realized one of the problems, I was in a VA inpatient thing called PrEP. Mm-hmm. And I realized as I went through this 3 weeks that like one of my issues is when I thought I was taking a break, I would, detach from whatever the task was, and I would go get on my phone and like scroll or do something like that, thinking that was a break. But what I realized is like a lot of what was stressing me was like this cognitive overload of being in all, going from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting and having these very engaged conversations and doing all this awesome stuff. And then in my quote unquote break, my mind is still at the same RPM. It's still, super engaged on this smartphone. And I realized like, that's not a break at all. Like I'm just pouring gasoline on the fire. And so it's made me realize like, okay, I have to actually be cognizant of the RPMs at which my brain, at which I'm forcing my brain to operate. And then if I am going to take a break because I start to feel this migraine coming on, don't get on something else that's like saying like, oh man, my hamstring's starting to hurt. Let me go get on this treadmill and put it up to like, a 4-minute mile. And that's going to be my break. Like you wouldn't do that, but that's what we do, is we don't think about the fact that we're carrying a supercomputer around in our pocket that is, super engaged with our brain, right? So that was something personally that I saw. But to your point on corporate culture, actually just today I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a CEO of a local company, and I was talking about some of these same things, because what I related to them is like, I'm not saying that he's going to provide the same level of like incredible services that we're trying to provide in SOCOM, but you can still look at taking some personal responsibility in each one of these 5 domains. And what I say is like at the end of each week, or at the end of every couple of weeks, look across those 5 domains and see, have you invested at all? Have you tried to invest in yourself at all in those 5 domains? And if not, just be aware that one of those red line incidents is likely to come, and it may not pop up in the same domain. Like I said earlier, when mine was physically in the tank, it manifested in psych, it manifested in mental health. And so, you're never stagnant. Right? You're always either getting better or getting worse in each one of those things. So the longer you don't invest in one of them, the longer you're not taking, you're not taking your quiet time in the morning to pray or to read the word, the more you're not investing in your family and making that time. For me, I'm very convicted that I want the time to be quality and not me just in the room. And so the more you have to be, the more I learn about this, the more I just realize I have to be intentional and not float through life and expect for it to go right. Like if I'm not intentionally investing in these things, my stock's going to go down in each one of them.
Well, and it's easy to get in that slope where it just then deteriorates. I like how you say do an inventory, whether it's weekly, whether it's every 2 weeks, but doing that inventory, a true litmus on yourself to evaluate that. I love that thought process. And then the other thing, that I wanted to say that I appreciate, Matt, is you bringing up the phone, because so easily in today's society, we just place it on teenage girls. Oh, teenage girls have
I'm
a
worse than
complete.
they are, Chad. Don't worry.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. It takes people like you, Matt, to say that. That's what I say. That don't project this on teenage girls, and they're the ones that are. Now, I understand that we can say yes. I mean, it's affecting teenage girls and the social media component, but let's not project that they're this outcast and it's because they're on their phones. It's society. I don't care if you're 85 years old, grandma or grandpa, all the way down. I mean, that phone is addictive in a multitude of measures, and you and I are not exempt, as you just said, and we have to recognize that. And I hope others start to recognize that as well. So I appreciate you saying that.
I mean, it's science, right? Like there's studies that show like the dopamine response that you have as you're engaged in some of those things is similar to that of the response to a drug. It's my worst addiction right now. I'll tell you, like I mentioned on another podcast, like I no longer use tobacco. I no longer drink, because both of those I felt like God told me to stop. Yeah. And so I will tell you that my phone is a super big addiction, to the equivalent, if not worse, than when I used to dip Copenhagen a can a day. Like, and we just, I'm not like, let's roll back to the Stone Ages, throw your phones away or anything else. But let's be cognizant of it, right?
Yeah,
like,
I know.
Let's realize the amount of time, like when people say, I don't have time for whatever. Yeah. And I'm guilty of this at times, where you're like, man, I'm just so busy, whatever else. Do an inventory of your day, and then do that screen time thing and look at your screen time, and how much of that are you engaged in something that is affirming and is proactive in one of those 5 domains, and how much are you just, for me, it's always condemning if I really want to look at those things and say, like, do I really not have time, or am I just willing, or am I not willing to give up this addiction to, scrolling whatever, or watching, whatever, something on TV. It is something that we should just be cognizant of. Like I said, I'm not a Stone Age guy. I think they're amazing tools. And I think like the opportunity for us to be able, like one of the things that I never thought I would do a podcast, right? Like it's crazy to me that I am on a podcast, and that it's a SOCOM podcast and it's widely available. Like it sort of drives me nuts. But the ability for us to have like a conversation like this, like to export the mentorship that we will get from each other through this conversation, and that I get from when I have these conversations with these amazing people on SOFcast, like the benefit is no longer confined to just the people within earshot. It can now be shared, and it can, like, that mentorship can proliferate in a way that was never possible. That's a godsend. That's amazing. That is something that technology has given us the opportunity. So I certainly believe that there are huge benefits to it. I just think we ought to, in the same way that we should moderate other things, we just have to understand that, it's not benign. I will say that.
100%. I mean, think about it. LinkedIn is the way you and I got connected. Social media platform, and all. So yes, there is good, and it's just like, it's not the technology. Is it going to be used for good, or can it be used and be abused? And to your point, and I think spot on that. All right, I have to get to the point of the show. Dude, we get on, and I love it, and it's obviously Christ over fear, and it's to hear Matt Parrish's story. I mean, usually I get into that in the first 5 minutes. We're at minute 33.
So what happens when you have 2 podcast hosts together, man.
I guess so, dude. I love it, man. It's awesome. But no, I want to hear your story. I don't even know where you're from, how you got in. I don't. I looked it up. I'm like, all right, you went to Norwich, but I don't know where you're from.
Here's what I like when I, hosting ours, I like not knowing those things, because I like to hear for the first time with the audience, because I tried a few of those where I did the pre-interview. Yeah. And I'm not a professional podcaster. I'm an SF guy. I can't fake that it's like, oh, I'm surprised by hearing this story. So I'm glad that you're like, I was terrible. I did 2 of those episodes, and I told our team, I was like, I'm not doing pre-interviews anymore. I want to have the natural authenticity of being surprised by something. So anyway, back to the actual part, now that we're 34 and a half minutes in. So I was born and raised just outside of Atlanta, northeast of Atlanta. And born and raised in a Christian home. I was an accident. My brother's 12 years older than I am. My sister's 14 years older than I am. So my parents, they weren't expecting to have another kid. In fact, my mom, they thought she had a tumor. They were going into like cancer screening.
Oh, wow.
And, she went to a doctor and they brought this thing out and she hears this da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. And she's like, what is that? And the doctor was like, oh, well, that's your tumor's heartbeat. And she started freaking out, like, a tumor has the heartbeat? He's like, no, you're pregnant. It was just like a complete surprise, right? And so that gave me an interesting childhood because I had siblings, but also was sort of an only child at times because they were,
Right.
graduating and going on to, so it was interesting. But I'm blessed to have been brought up in a Christ-affirming, believing. My brother liked to always joke that we grew up with a drug problem in that every time the doors of the church were open, we got drugged through them, right? So it didn't matter if it was Wednesday night, didn't matter if it was Monday night, whatever was going on, because my dad was involved. He was leading worship as a choir leader. He was a staff parish, president, all these different things, except for being a pastor. And my mom was, she was teaching Sunday school. She was a youth, helping with the youth volunteer, all these different things. So we were at church all the time, right? And it is what we do in our family is we believe in the blood of Christ to redeem us. We believe in worship. We believe in studying the Bible. Like, I'm blessed that is something that is foundational to our family, but it's also something that I was allowed to come up in and make my own choice in and not feel like, I did feel like this is what we did, but it wasn't like, oh, I'm some brainwashed, person that didn't have my own free choice. Like, I'm just blessed that was the foundation upon which my parents and my family raised me. So I'm infinitely thankful for that. Right.
Well, and can I ask you a question real
Yeah.
quick, Matt? Because I think that's huge, and I love hearing that, and just the foundation that your parents planted in you and your siblings. How, like, looking back on it, and what do you take now as a parent of children to instill that same thing because there's the flip of where others, they're brought in that and it almost feels like it's punishment to a way. And it sounds like your parents did it in such a way, in such a manner that it didn't turn you off, and I know it's each family dynamic's different, but what do you take from your parents that you can share with others out there who want to plant that foundation, but also don't want to take it to such an event that that it casts kids aside where they don't want to pursue Christ when they have the choice.
No, 100%. And I am in no way saying that I was saved at 6. I'm in no way saying that I was saved at 6 and then it was all smooth sailing from there. And I was, I rebelled worse. Like, I look back, I was a terrible sinner and believer in high school, especially, right? Because I did have my rebellious time, and I did I had the foundation. I knew I was saved. I knew the right answer, but I still, wandered on that path away and had to return as a prodigal, right? Like, it is not, I certainly wouldn't say that, it's like, oh man, but I think as the word says, if you bring them up in the way and you hide it in their hearts, they will come back and they will, that will be foundational. Right. And that was the story for me. Right. Like, I take from I wish I was as good a father as my father. He unfortunately just passed about 6 weeks ago or so, but
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that, man.
Yeah. But hey, man, I feel like I'm called to talk about that in a way that, first of all, I'm a little jaded as far as death goes, period, from the job, but it's not a final thing to me. So I'm not destroyed by the fact that I lost my father, because I know 100% that I will see him again and that he's in glory. Like, there's not a single person at his funeral that was like, I wonder, that man made it his life's work to ensure that A, none of us lied at his funeral, and B, none of us had a question, right? Like, he was all in for Jesus at all times. And to the point where it did make me rebel at certain times. I hated when we would be around the dinner table or whatever, or even worse, Christmas morning. Oh man, Christmas morning, all you want to do is open presents, and my dad would reach for the Bible and like, all right, you can open one present, and then we're reading like all of Luke, you know, and I'm like, no, you know, as a kid, you're like, no,
Yeah.
but now I realize, like, man, first of all, it was a foundation thing, and that he was modeling that the word is important, it's foundational, but also the fact that he gave us time, and he cared enough to where he was not just present, like I said earlier, he was engaged. And hey, man, he was as stubborn as I am. And sometimes you didn't care if you wanted to hear the word or not; you were going to hear it.
Yeah,
And
right.
that's just what it was going to be. And
Yeah.
you know, I grew up. I hated some of those things, right? Like, he did not want us to you know, go to eat anywhere on Sunday or whatever it was, and I hated that. I couldn't stand that, like, funny now, but like The Simpsons. I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons growing up. And I'd go to my friend's house and watch The Simpsons and whatever else because I was like, oh, this is so funny and whatever. But in his house, like, we don't watch that because he watched one episode and there was, you know, a huge amount of disrespect between Bart and Homer. And he was like, we're not having that in my house. You know,
Yeah.
I hated it. Right.
Yeah.
So, but I never had a doubt where he stood.
Right.
And I never had a doubt that, you know, there's mercy and grace in that, right? Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't, I'm going to smack you over the head with the Bible. I think what I try to take from all of that is, like, to be transparent with my kids, like, why I've made that choice. Not, I didn't make the choice because, well, first of all, it's because Christ pursued me through
Right.
all of the things where I wanted to walk away, and I continued to walk away, and he kept grabbing me and saying, I'm still with you. Like, whether, you know, pursued me and continues to pursue me all the time. But it's not out of, like, my relationship with the Lord is not out of it's not out of some just religious, you know, continuance of like, well, we just go to you know, we go
Right.
to church, whatever. Like, there is a nurture and a feeding to going and reading the Bible and hearing the word and being with other believers and things that has made me who I am. Like, I would not be successful in any shape or form without him. And so I want to be, when I talk to my kids about it, I want to be open and honest about why. It wasn't just because I was, you know, raised up as a Christian. Like, I have personally seen his mercy, his grace, his provision in my life tenfold to what I deserve, right? And so that's what I want my kids to know, is not like, this is, oh, we're just checking a block because that's what we do. Like, no, there's authentic goodness from this walk with the Lord that you can have freely, right?
Well, and it reminds me, my pastor down in Florida used to say, you know, to live a Christian life is not to be a good person. Yeah, that can be a benefit. That can be like a subset of what happens, but it's about living your life in such a manner and such a faith in Christ that the stories that you have to share, especially with our children, they will know from our experiences of what, when we know that Christ was right in the center of it, those are the faith stories that draw then our young ones in. And it sounds like that's kind of what you do now, and also what your father and mother did from, you know, from raising you up in that environment as well.
Yeah, and like I said, I was a terrible kid. So I would also give encouragement to the fact that, like, you know, you continue, right? Like, your kids are going to rebel, and God's not giving up on them, and neither are you. And I know that mine are 8, 6, and 4 right now, and I hung the moon for them, and I'm trying to soak up every bit of that right now, because it's amazing when I come home and they're just stoked that I walk through the door. And I am so convicted when you know, part of the reason that I'm seeking all this help in mental health and all these other things is because I don't want my irritability and my own garbage to be a reason why I'm not nurturing and just soaking in every bit I can of this precious time that will be gone so soon. And, you know, I don't want my junk to imprint upon them because daddy's done all these things in his career and has all this stress and whatever else. Like, I need to make sure that I'm as intentional as possible, because it's not going to last. Like there's going to be
Yeah.
a time where they don't think daddy's as cool as he is right now. And they're going to, they're going to rebel. They're going to walk away and all those things. And all I can pray for is that, I can't light the spark in their heart. I can just stack wood and pray that God lights the spark. Right. So I
Yeah.
just want to stack as much wood as I can around their hearts and pray and pray and pray that he will pursue them in the same way that he's pursued me. Right. That he'll light that fire, and that the wood that we stack around as mother and father, it will ignite. Right. Like that's my prayer. Right.
Oh, dude, I love it. You know what? One thing on that too, there's also though, like I've seen some people like, I saw a post one time. It was like, it was a sign that, they had at their door. Like, when I walk through this as a dad, I leave everything from work, everything I leave
I
at the
wish.
door. Exactly. And my point on
Yeah.
that too, though, is I also think it's healthy for our kids, and it's teachable moments when we do screw up, because we're not, I mean, there's only one that's ever been, perfect, and that's Christ. And that's why we need him. That's why I need him each and every day. And so I think it's also teachable though, that when we do get out of line and we, maybe raise our voice, or we don't act the way we wish we would have acted once we've had that time to step back, like those are teachable moments on owning it, acknowledging our screw up, and teaching our children so that they understand too, that it's not this perfect lifestyle, that to follow Christ is to live a perfect life, because that's false. And that's going to put, a facade in front to make it be like, well, no, you're a hypocrite. What's your thoughts on that?
100%. And I will tell you, it rang really true to me recently. One of the really most, when you look at the course of your life on a timeline, and there's big moments that, transcend. When my daughter was 2 years old and my middle daughter was a newborn, we got in a terrible accident with myself and the 2-year-old in the car on a Saturday afternoon in Fort Walton Beach. I'd taken her to the zoo, daddy-daughter day. We're returning. It's the middle of the day. I'm sitting at a red light, and a guy hits us doing 65 miles an hour, never touches his brakes. And it was like getting ID'd, right? We just blow up, super intense story of, I thought she was dead. The whole car is wrapped around her. There's like 4 or 5 miracles in there of like literally minor things that if the decision had gone the other way, she's dead, I'm dead, all these different things. Like one of which was I had a giant Yeti cooler. This was a Honda Accord that I used as a gas sipper. I had a giant Yeti cooler in the trunk that morning that I just happened to be like, oh, I don't need that in the trunk today. And I took it out. Like she was already buckled. We were already leaving. And I just made that decision. And if that trunk has a giant Yeti cooler in it, it doesn't wrap around the same way around her car seat that it ends up doing. But anyway, I come to a clover leaf around the vehicle, trying to get her out. Like, I'd already been a team for a long time at this point. And I thought she was dead, right? 100%. So fast forward, she's miraculously, unscathed. She's got bit lip, a few minor things, but I thought she was dead 100%, right? And I was just praying, she's falling asleep, she's concussed. I'm just praying and screaming to God, like, take all of this and put it on me. Please save my daughter, all these things. And so it's why I try to be positive. Like I've had all these neck surgeries and people are like, oh, how do you stay motivated? It's like, I got what I asked for.
Yeah.
Right? My daughter's walking around today, and I'll take every surgery. I'll take every bit of physical therapy. I'll take all of this, medicine and everything that I have to do every day because she's walking around. But back to what I was, that's the lead into why now, as you talk about, like, it's not all perfect. There's times now where she's right now as my 8-year-old, she's my most rebellious child. Like she will go straight to like red line and just blow up on things, and it will make me blow up. And there's a realization at times where we're just two people with TBI, like losing it.
Right.
And I'll realize like, oh wait, you know what? It's my fault. Like I'm the parent. I've got to realize that we both have, she's got this same tendency that I do, most likely as a result of a serious TBI, to just go straight to a red line. And there's times where I have to come in and say, hey, listen, baby, I'm wrong right now. You and I are both in what we call red face, because I was in this inpatient program where they did art therapy. And one of the things that we did was a mask. And I made this mask that was red, and I basically wrote all of the bad things that I experienced from stress, operator syndrome, whatever you want to call it. Right. And then there's a sort of mask that goes on top of it. And I use it now as like a thing with my kids to talk about, like, hey, this is what it looks like when we lose control. And it's kind of a scary looking mask. It's fiery and has all these, bad things written all over it. Anger, rage, all these things, headaches, all the stuff that I was feeling. And my daughter immediately, when she saw it, like, she's like, it made sense to her, right? Yeah. She's in the same place as a kid. And so being real with her, like, hey, daddy feels the same way. Like, I go into this complete, red face mode. And sometimes you and I are yelling at each other and we're both in red face, and neither one of us is going to get better out of that. So how do we come in? How do I come in humbly and say, like, hey, let's both take some breaths. Let's both come back together. Like, it's not her job to do that as an 8-year-old.
Right.
It's my job to do that. And it's my job to be real about it, in the fact that, like, hey, you know what? Daddy's not able to control his emotions right now. So we both need to be able to, like, come in and take some breaths and pray about it and try to, come back to where we have a rational conversation. But it's, it's being real with them, right? Like,
100%.
Saying, like, hey, I have problems with this too, right? And the realization on her face sometimes when I'm able to break out of my own red face and come into that is like, it's such a relief to her to know that, like, no, this is something that we're both dealing with, and that, daddy loves me. We're not, this is not going to be anything that goes further than right now.
Well, and then it's you're creating a safe environment for her, right? You've created a safe environment where then she can be herself and share that, like, she's not alone in that journey, of what's experiencing, by, for lack of better terms, leading from the front of what you're doing. Which I think is pivotal. I think I'd be interested, taking it back to our previous conversation, or our first part of our conversation. I mean, a lot of that most likely is from what you do in the preservation of the force and the family, of incorporating that and actually living that out of what, you have worked on to preserve yourself and the family, is then applying it at the household.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it's been a blessing for me to, to have this job. Like I said, I felt led. I felt like God told me to volunteer for this job. It was a bit of a almost career suicide. Like, I was on a path to continue to go up the chain as a CSM and all these things, and this job is not on that PD model, right?
Yeah.
And but I really felt like God was telling me to take it, and at the time I thought it was just for me to give back. And I thought, and now looking back, the hand of the Lord, seeing that it was also so that I could work through some of my stuff, and so that I could, through trying to run, help run this organization, that I could individually work on some of this stuff so that I don't pass that stuff to my kids from being, from being out of control and being super stressed, and for them to know me as just some irritable guy. Like, they deserve my absolute best, not whatever's a byproduct of everything at work and stress and whatever else. And I was not able, like the guy you said that has the sign, I wasn't able to just turn that off. Like, I needed to, and I continue to need to work on that. But that's what I prioritize. That's what's important to me, is like, I want to do that work to ensure that my kids know me as their loving father, and, hopefully reflecting some of the light that Christ has given me back to them, rather than being known as like, oh yeah, dad was a Green Beret and he was a great patriot and he did all these things for his country, but man, he's mean as a cur. You know, like, how many guys do you know?
I know.
Like, know, and I don't want that. Right. I would rather, I would rather give up anything else. And I want to do that work so that that's, my kids, that's not the legacy I leave them,
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Hey, I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up, and we'll end on this one, because it's hearing your story and how, at such a young age, and the household you were raised in, Christ was at the center of that home, which is unbelievable and unbelievably awesome. and that carried through, and it's carrying through your life today, and you and your wife's family and the children you have. My one question with Christ over fear, the reason I named the show that is because, oftentimes, even for me, I've got to be able to trust Christ over the fear or the worry, the anxiety, the anger, whatever is manifesting, below Christ, but does it become above Christ? And that's why I named it what I named it. And my question for you is, can you share with us a time frame, whether it's combat, whether it's, throughout or whenever it is, when, the fear of the circumstances, or maybe it's not fear, maybe it's anger, maybe it's questioning, maybe it's doubt, got to a point where it was superseding your faith in Christ and what you did to navigate that. So people can kind of hear how you came about, knowing that your faith is there, but where it wavered for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a ton of times, right? Like we all have a wall. Like one of the reasons that I'm like reticent to have some of these conversations is because when you take these conversations and you just like, it's hard not to come across as like, oh yeah, everything's great. Like I know, like no matter how much you're like, hey, no, I screw up all the time. Like it still somehow comes across as like, oh, this guy's got it all together. Like I do not. Right. Like I'm still.
Well, that's the reason for this is to bring guys like you on and to have these, the mic, have these conversations where people can hear like, and they're questioning their faith, or they're not there yet. And they're like, well, what's that all about? To hear real guys, real stories, not being perfect, but being raw, transparent, real on the journey, so that can invigorate. Because I think those stories are what attract people to God's word.
Yeah. I've had an incredible, again, my career is only a success due to God's provision. Like I have never been the smartest, fastest, strongest. Like nobody thought I was going to be a Green Beret when I was in high school. Nobody that was like a year before I joined, or whatever. Like people wouldn't even have thought I was going to join the military, much less that I was going to be some special forces guy. Like everybody laughed, right? Like it just was not like. And it wasn't like the captain of I wasn't a West Point, quarterback or anything. It's like people would have never thought, right? And I remember in selection, right? I had that moment, right, where I was just like, it was part of land nav, and our land nav is a pretty tough part of selection. And I got to a point where I was like, this point should be here. I'd moved all night. I got to the point I'm doing, I did all of my search pattern and everything else, and I'm like, I have exhausted every bit of myself. I cannot find this point, and it should be here. And I just finally was like, Lord, if this is the moment where you tell me like that this has all been of my own want, and that this is not the path, then I got it. This is the moment. Like, but if you want me, if my path is to become a Green Beret, I need you to supernaturally show me this point, because I have exhausted all of my own ability. And I literally just prayed that in the middle of the woods with a rucksack on, just like, God, if this is your will for me to be a special forces guy, you've got to show me, because I'm done. Like, I can't find this point. And I literally opened my eyes and saw Kimline. And I'm like, okay. Right. And so I walked over there, and it's my point. Right. And like, that sounds like lunacy to a non-believer, right? But as real as I'm sitting here talking to you, that's what happened, right? Yeah. And I'm not a lunatic. Like, if there was something blocking that, so that I had to reaffirm that it's not going to be me who does this. It's going to be you that does it. And I just want to be in your path and not in mine, right? And that has happened continually throughout my career. Even having those moments, it's just like Israel in the Old Testament. Like, they had these moments where they saw the cloud of fire and the smoke, and then they still wandered away, right? I did the same thing my entire life. Like, I have these moments where I know, and then shiny, and I go, and then I have to, God's got to hit me with a 2x4, so that I come back to him and say, hey, listen, I've exhausted myself. I need you to, and I'm going through it right now as I look at potentially transitioning next year. I have to continue to reaffirm to myself that, yes, you need to do some work to network and try to do whatever. But I have to continue to reaffirm in prayer that, God, I want whatever you have for me and not what I'm going to work on and try to get. Like, my biggest concern is that I'm going to bullheadedly go chase something else that's not his path.
Right.
And so trying to have the discernment of where do I sit back and just try to, watch where he's got me, and where do I need to put in the work? Because I'm also don't want to ever be the lazy, hey, just bring it to me, right?
Yeah, right.
But I think with that point in selection, I had to do the work to get to the point where I was there, but I had to submit to the fact that it was him, not me, or I would have never found that point.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the same throughout the rest of my life, and it continues. Yeah.
Oh man, we could go on forever, because I mean, what you just talked about too is
Yeah.
like, his will, not mine.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, and like that's a struggle. Like, okay, well, this is my question. I'm always like, okay, I'm really thinking this is his will, and I enjoy it too, and it's a desire of my heart. And then I struggle, like, oh well, now I'm making this all about me, and it's like such a battle. And I think sometimes I need to recognize, no, if it's his will and it's something that he's given me a desire in my heart, chase it full-fledged, chase it. And that's most likely the enemy trying to be a distractor and trying to deceive and lie and do what he does on this, because he's got to stay in the fight and here on earth. So
my prayer for that, Chad, is always like, God, that I'm a preacher. That I'm leaning forward. My work ethic. That I'm going to keep going. So don't just slam the door, slam it, bar it, hit me with a 2x4, because I'm going to keep going through it.
Right.
And just keep hitting me with a 2x4 until but don't stop. Don't stop hitting me with a 2x4 until I get back on your will.
Right.
And because I'm going to keep driving. Yeah. Right? I'm going to find a window and jump in just like I did it as an assaulter. Right. So
I love it.
Man, 100%.
Hey, I can't thank you enough for coming on here. I know you got a hectic schedule with everything you're doing down there in Tampa, and really appreciate you taking the time. I can't thank Chris Copper enough for introing us so that we could have this, but really appreciate you having on, man. And let's not make this the last iteration.
Yeah, sounds good. Hey, Chad, I'm always like, the deal. There's times in your career where you sort of just allude to your faith, and then it's amazing to me to be able to be in a position where I can talk more openly about it, not as a guy who's got it figured out, but just as a guy who's trying to continue to walk in his way, because I've done it my own way and I don't like it. It's but his way.
Well, right? And I love what you do though too. You and Chris and Mike Burke coming on. I mean, you guys you're still in it. You're still donning in the uniform, and I think that encourages those younger individuals to be able to share their faith and be bold in their faith. That's what Christ wants us. He doesn't want us to be timid and fearful. So I appreciate you. And you're not retired, you're not out yet, but still able to be that bold in your faith, which is a testament to your belief in him. So I think that's awesome, man.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Chad. Yeah, and thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. All right, have a good one.
You too.
All right, folks. Hey, episode 15 of Christ Over Fear. That wraps up today. Matt Parrish down at U.S. Special Operations Command, host of SOFcast. I can't recommend it enough. So please go on there, subscribe, listen to that podcast and everything he's doing with the preservation of the force and the family, which is much needed. And obviously, it was the first half of our conversation today on this episode. So until next time, continue the fight, the good fight, and we'll see you next week.